Story 1. Our first story comes from a man named Mark, unexperienced solo backpacker who thought he knew the mountains of the Pacific Northwest like the back of his hand. He prided himself on his self-reliance, his state-of-the-art gear, and his unerring sense of direction. He believed that with the right preparation, there was nothing the wilderness could throw at him that he couldn't handle. This belief was tested and then utterly shattered during a 3-day trek through a remote section of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Mark had planned a route that would take him far from any designated trails. He was seeking true isolation, the kind of silence that hums in your ears. For the first day and a half, he found it. The forest was majestic, a cathedral of ancient Douglas firs and western hemlocks. The air was crisp and clean. He felt powerful, alive. He made camp the second night by a small, clear stream, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. It was, as he was packing up his tent on the third morning that he first heard it. Preet. It was a simple, cheerful tune. A four-note melody repeated over and over. Pride. It sounded like another person, maybe a hiker who had wandered off path, just like him. It was distant but clear in the morning air. Mark wasn't concerned. If anything, he was slightly annoyed that his perfect solitude had been interrupted. He checked his compass, confirmed his bearing, and started his hike toward the rendezvous point where his car was parked some 10 miles away. He walked for about an hour. The sounds of his own boots on the forest floor, the only company he had. Then he heard it again. Brew, the same four-note whistle. This time it sounded closer, and it seemed to be coming from the direction he was heading. He paused, listening. The tune was almost playful. He called out, "Hello! Is anyone there?" The whistling stopped. Only the wind answered. He shrugged it off and continued. A seed of unease had been planted. The forest, which had felt so welcoming just hours before, now seemed to watch him. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, darker. Another hour passed. Plop. And there it was. Again, bluff. The whistle. It was definitely closer now. Perhaps only a few hundred yards ahead of him, just beyond a thick stand of ferns. "Hey!" he shouted, a little more forcefully this time. "Everything all right over there?" Again, the whistling ceased instantly. Silence. Mark stood still for a full minute, scanning the woods. Nothing. No movement. No sign of another human being. Poof. It was deeply strange. He pulled out his compass again. The needle quivered for a moment before settling. B was still on the right course, he told himself. It was just the acoustics of the forest, a strange echo. But he knew, deep down, that wasn't true. The sound was too clear, too deliberate. He decided to alter his course slightly, to put some distance between himself and whatever was making that sound. He veered north, planning to loop around and rejoin his original path later. He bushwhacked through dense undergrowth for what felt like an eternity. He was sweating, his pack feeling heavier with every step. Finally, he broke through into a small, sun-dappled clearing, and stopped to catch his breath. Bow. And as he stood there, leaning against a moss-covered boulder, the whistle started again. It was right behind him, so close, he felt he could have reached out and touched the source. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. There was nothing there, just the empty clearing and the silent, imposing trees. He wasn't just uneasy now, he was scared. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't another hiker. This was something else. He pulled out his GPS. The screen flickered, the satellite connection struggling under the dense canopy. It placed him 2 miles away from where he thought he was. According to the device, he had been walking in a circle. Panic began to bubble in his chest. He fought it down, relying on his training. Panic gets you killed. He took a deep, steadying breath and checked his compass again. He agreed with the GPS. He had been thoroughly disoriented. How he decided his only option was to follow his compass directly west, toward the road he knew was somewhere out there. He ignored the trails, ignored the terrain, and just focused on the needle. He started walking faster now, a grim determination setting in, and the whistling followed. It was no longer just ahead of him. Now, it seemed to come from all directions at once. First from his left, then his right, then from high up in the canopy above. The cheerful little tune had taken on a mocking, insidious quality. It was a predator toying with its prey. Mark didn't shout again. He didn't want to give it the satisfaction. He just walked, his eyes darting around, his hand gripping the handle of the small hatchet on his belt. The character of the whistling began to change. It was no longer just the 4-note tune. It began to mimic other sounds. Purse. It was a perfect imitation of a Stellus jay. So flawless he almost dismissed it. But then the bird call ended with the same 4-note melody. Then he heard the sound of a woman crying softly. The sound was heartbreakingly real, and it seemed to come from just behind a large, fallen log. For a moment, his training warred with his instinct to help, but he knew he was a trick. He kept walking, his heart aching. The sun began to dip below the towering peaks, and the forest sank into a deep twilight gloom. Mark knew he had to make camp, but the thought of spending a night out here with that thing was unbearable. He pressed on, pushing his exhausted body to its limits. That's when the whistling became personal. He heard his name, Mark. It was a perfect imitation of his mother's voice. Put the voice that had called him in for dinner as a child. It was so unexpected, so deeply wrong, that he stopped dead in his tracks. Tears pricked his eyes. Mark, where are you? He squeezed his eyes shut. You're not real, he whispered, his voice trembling. You're not real. The whistling returned, the cheerful tune now sounding utterly demonic in the growing darkness. He stumbled on, tripping over roots. He couldn't see, his mind a whirlwind of terror. and confusion. Pritch, he found a small rock overhang, barely a cave, and decided it was the most defensible position he was going to find. He crawled inside, pulling his pack in front of him like a shield. He sat there in the cold, damp darkness, listening. For hours, there was only silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that felt more threatening than the noise. He started to think, to hope, that maybe it had given up, that it had lost him. He was just starting to drift into an exhausted, fretful sleep when he heard a new sound. It was the sound of a zipper. His zipper, the one on his tent. The exact, specific sound it had made that morning when he packed it away. The sound was coming from about 50 feet away, out in the darkness. Then he heard the sound of his metal camp stove being clicked, followed by the soft whoosh of it igniting. He was hearing a perfect audio replay of his morning routine. He stayed frozen, barely breathing. After the phantom stove was lit, the whistling began again. Bow. This time, it was different. It was low, breathy, and tuneless. It was the sound of someone casually whistling to themselves as they went about a task. And it was getting closer. He could hear something moving through the undergrowth, not walking like a human or an animal. It was a dry, scraping, slithering sound. The sound of dead leaves and twigs being dragged across the ground with every passing second. The scraping and the low, breathy whistle got closer to his small hiding spot. Mark fumbled in his pack for his headlamp, his fingers numb with cold and fear. He found the switch and flicked it on, pointing the beam out of the overhang. The light cut through the darkness and landed on it. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to be composed of grey, peeling bark and tangled dead branches. It had long, spindly limbs that ended in what looked like clusters of twigs. It had no face, no eyes, no arch, just a smooth, bark-like surface where a mouth should have been. And from that featureless face came the whistling, a sound that was somehow wet and dry at the same time. It froze in the beam of his light, its twig-like, fingers twitching. For a heartbeat, man and monster were locked in a silent tableau. Then the thing took a scraping step towards him. Mark screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of pure terror. Flee! He scrambled out of the other side of the overhang, leaving his pack and all his gear behind. He just ran. He ran blindly through the pitch-black forest, branches whipping at his face, rocks tearing at his clothes. The whistling was right behind him, a constant, mocking companion in the darkness. He could hear the scraping sound of its body dragging through the leaves, keeping pace with him effortlessly. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He collapsed at the base of a massive tree, sobbing, convinced he was about to die. He curled into a ball, waiting for the twig-like fingers to close around him. But nothing happened. The whistling and the scraping had stopped. There was only the sound of his own ragged breathing. He lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. Finally, driven by a desperate, flickering ember of hope, he got to his feet and stumbled on. He doesn't remember much about the rest of the night. It was a blur of pain, fear, and exhaustion. As the first hints of dawn began to pierce the canopy, P saw it, a dark, straight line through the trees, a road. He stumbled out of the forest and onto the asphalt, a wild, broken thing. A passing motorist found him an hour later, suffering from exposure, dehydration, and a profound psychological shock. Mark never went back into the woods. He sold all his gear. He says the creature, the whistler, doesn't need to hunt. It lets you hunt yourself. It disorients you, isolates you, and then uses your own memories to break your mind. It feeds on fear. And sometimes, even now, on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, he thinks he can hear a faint, four-note melody carried on the breeze. And he knows it's still out there, on its trail, waiting for the next person to get lost. Story. 2 professionals who work in the deep wilderness. Lagos. Search and rescue personnel tend to be pragmatic people. They've seen the strange and unexplainable, but they usually find a way to rationalize it. An animal. Track. They can't identify a strange light in the sky. Every now and then, they encounter something so fundamentally wrong that it defies all explanation and leaves a permanent scar on their soul. This is the story of a park ranger named Frank and his experience with what the old local folklore called grief moss. Frank had been a ranger in a sprawling, rugged national park in Appalachia for nearly 30 years. He was a man made of leather and quiet. Competence. Peed, found lost children, tracked poachers, and stared down more than one angry bear. He thought he had a handle on the park's rhythms, its secrets, and its dangers. The park was his church and his office, a place he understood, until the disappearances started in the section they called the Black Bog. The Black Bog wasn't a large area, maybe only a square mile, but it was treacherous. A low-lying basin of stagnant water, ancient cypress trees, and thick-sucking mud. People were warned to stay out, and most did. The first one to go missing was a tourist, a young man who'd ignored the sign. They searched for a week before Frank found him. The man was sitting at the base of a gnarled cypress tree, leaning back as if he were resting. There were no signs of a struggle, no animal wounds, no foul play. P's backpack, full of food and water, was sitting right beside him. Poor. The only strange thing was that his body was covered in a thick... It wasn't like any moss Frank had ever seen. It clung to the man's clothes, his skin, his hair. It seemed to have grown over him with an unnatural speed. The coroner's report was inconclusive. The cause of death was listed as undetermined, though they noted he was severely dehydrated, which made no sense given the full water bottle at his side. They chalked it up to a tragic, bizarre accident. 6 months later, a local woman vanished. She was a known hiker, but she'd recently lost her husband to cancer, and her friends said she had been herself. Her car was found parked at the trailhead, nearest to the Black Bog. Again, a massive search was launched, and again it was Frank who found her. She was in the same area, not 50 yards from where the first body was discovered. She was lying in a patch of the same black moss, a serene, almost blissful smile on her face. Like the first victim, she was covered in the stuff. And, like the first victim, she was profoundly dehydrated, but otherwise untouched. This time, the Park Service took it seriously. They sent a biologist out to take samples of the moss. The results that came back were baffling. The moss was an unknown species. It didn't photosynthesize. It had a complex root-like system, but it didn't seem to draw nutrients from the soil or the trees it grew on. It was, for all intents and purposes, biologically impossible. It shouldn't have been able to exist, let alone thrive. Frank started digging into the park's history, talking to the old-timers in the nearby town. Most of them just repeated the warnings to stay away from the bog. Bo, one very old woman whose family had lived in those hills for generations, told him a story. She called the black moss Oathcurd, an old Gaelic term. She translated as grief moss. She said it didn't feed on sunlight or water. It fed on sorrow. She said it could smell a broken heart from a mile away and would sing a silent song to lure the grieving into its embrace, offering them peace in exchange for their life. Frank was a practical man. He didn't believe in silent songs or sorrow-eating plants, but he couldn't ignore the pattern. By the first victim, the tourist. They later learned he had just gone through a devastating breakup. The second victim, the local woman, was a grieving widow. The moss. The impossibly peaceful expressions on their faces. The dehydration. It was starting to form a terrifying, unbelievable picture. The park officially closed the Black Bog section, posting signs that warned of unstable ground and toxic fungus. But Frank knew a sign wouldn't be enough. The silent song. The old woman spoke of pews beginning to understand. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, an emotional pull. The third disappearance hit him personally. It was a young deputy sheriff named Ben, a good kid Frank had known since he was a boy. Ben's 5-year-old daughter had died in a car accident just 2 months prior. The whole town was devastated, but Ben and his wife were shells of their former selves. One evening, Ben's wife called Frank in a panic. Ben had left a note, saying he was going for a walk to clear his head, and his service weapon was still at home. But he'd been gone for hours, and his car was found at the Black Bog trailhead. Frank knew. He knew where Ben was going. He didn't wait for the search party. He grabbed his high-powered flashlight and went into the bog alone, violating every rule he had ever enforced. The air in the Black Bog was different at night. It was heavy, thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. But there was something else. Too, a feeling. An overwhelming wave of melancholy washed over Frank as he pushed deeper in. It wasn't just the gloom of the place. Palpable presence. He felt his own old griefs bubble to the surface. The loss of his wife to a sudden illness a decade ago. A pain he thought he had buried deep. The memories were so vivid, so sharp. It felt like it had happened yesterday. He had to stop, leaning against a tree, his breath catching in his throat. He understood then. This was the lure. The song. It didn't create sadness. It amplified what was already there, until it was all you could feel. A crushing weight that made you just want to lie down and let go. Peeve. He pushed the feelings down. His years of discipline fighting against the unnatural influence of the place. He called Ben's name, his voice sounding small and weak in the oppressive silence. P. Followed the pull, the concentration of sorrow deeper into the bog's heart. And then he saw him. Ben was lying in the center of the largest patch of grief Moss Frank had ever seen. It was a clearing of pure, velvety black. The moss pulsed with a faint internal luminescence, like a field of dying stars. Ben was on his back, his arms spread wide, black tendrils of the moss already creeping up his clothes onto his neck and face. His eyes were open, staring up at the canopy, and on his face was the same look of absolute peace that had haunted Frank for months. "Ben!" Frank shouted, running forward, his boots sinking into the mud. Ben turned his head slowly. His voice was a dreamy, distant whisper. "It's okay, Fra. She's here. I can feel her. But pain, it's gone." Frank reached the edge of the moss. As he did, the wave of sorrow hit him with the force of a physical blow. He saw his wife's face, heard her laugh. The moss was offering him the same deal. "Let go of the pain. We can take it. Lie down. Rest." The temptation was immense, a siren call to his own weary, lonely soul. It felt so easy, so right, to just give in. Bah! Then he looked at Ben's face, at the life draining out of him, and his ranger's instinct took over. This thing wasn't offering peace. Parasite, bitter lie, Frank yelled, grabbing the front of the deputy's shirt. He pulled, but Ben was a dead weight. Frank dug his heels in, the mud sucking at his boots, and heaved with all his strength. He felt a strange resistance, as if the moss itself was holding on, but with a final, desperate grunt. He ripped Ben free from the patch. Ben started to scream, a horrible, tearing sound of a man being ripped away from paradise. The peaceful look was gone, replaced by raw agony. "You shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have." He shrieked, thrashing in the mud. Frank dragged him away, back through the oppressive gloom of the bog. Behind them, the patch of black moss seemed dim, its faint light fading as its meal was stolen away. Ben survived, but a part of him was left behind in that bog. He was institutionalized forever, caught between the crushing reality of his grief and the memory of the perfect, painless peace the moss had offered him. Frank retired a year later. He couldn't walk into that park anymore without feeling the cold touch of the bog, without hearing the echo of its silent, sorrowful song. He knows the moss is still there, a patient, ancient predator. It doesn't need teeth or claws. It just waits quietly for the broken-hearted to wander in, offering a final, fatal comfort to those who have lost all hope. Story 3. Some places are not just haunted by spirits, but by ideas, by rituals that have soaked into the soil and stained the very trees. Our next story is about a young woman named Clara. an artist who inherited a property she thought would be her sanctuary. Instead, it became her prison, bound to a legacy she never knew she had. Clara was a sculptor. She worked with metal and reclaimed wood, creating large, abstract pieces. When her estranged great-aunt passed away, Clara was shocked to learn she had been left a small house and 10 acres of dense woodland in rural Maine. She had only met the woman Elspeth a few times as a child and remembered her as a severe, quiet woman who smelled of dried herbs and woods, seeing it as a perfect artist's retreat. Clara packed her life up and moved in. The house was old but solid, filled with dusty antiques and the lingering scent of her great-aunt. The woods, however, were the real prize. They were old growth, a tangled and beautiful wilderness. On her 3rd day there, while exploring the property, she found it deep in a grove of birch trees. There was a small, chapel-like structure. By it was about the size of a garden shed, but it was made entirely of woven wicker reeds and twisted branches. It was an incredible piece of folk art, intricate and strange. It had a peaked roof and an arched doorway, but no doors or windows. Inside, the floor was bare earth, and against the back wall was a small, flat stone that served as an altar. Clara was mesmerized. She assumed her great-aunt, a woman she barely knew, must have been a secret artist herself. She started spending her days in the woods, sketching the wicker chapel, as she called it. It had a powerful, almost magnetic presence, but she soon began to notice odd things. One morning, she saw a dead raven lying on the stone altar inside. She assumed. An animal had dragged it in and cleaned it out. A few days later, she found a squirrel laid out in the same spot. Then a rabbit. It was unsettling, but she rationalized it as the work of a fox or an owl that had claimed the chapel as its den. The real strangeness began about a month after she arrived. She was working on a sketch when she noticed something different about the chapel's facade. There was a new detail, a small, swirling pattern of woven reeds near the doorway that she was certain had been there the day before. It was seamlessly integrated, as if it had always been a part of the design. She checked her previous sketches. It wasn't there. She felt a chill, dismissing it as a trick of her memory, but it kept happening. A week later, a new spire of twisted willow, thin as a whip, had been added to the peak of the roof. The week after that, the chapel was changing, growing, disturbed. Clara decided to clean out her great-aunt's study, hoping to find a clue, a journal, anything. Tucked away in a locked desk drawer, she found a series of leather-bound diaries. The entries, written in Elspeth's spidery handwriting, spanned 50 years. The early entries were normal, talking about gardening and the changing seasons. Birth. Then, she started mentioning the kindred grove and the offering house. She wrote about building it, following the old ways. Her own grandmother had taught her. She wrote that the house wasn't art. It was a pact, a living entity that watched over the family's land and, in exchange, required sustenance. Oof. The entries grew more obsessive. Elspeth wrote about the offerings. At first, it was just wildflowers and berries. Then, small animals she found dead in the woods. But the chapel, she wrote, grew listless. It demanded more. So she started trapping them. A diary detailed, in chillingly practical terms, how to snap a rabbit's neck, how to bleed out a deer. She believed that by feeding the chapel, she was feeding the spirit of the land, ensuring its protection and her own vitality. It takes from the wood to give to the blood, she wrote over and over. The wicker grows, so the line may live. The final entries were frantic, almost illegible. Elspeth wrote that the chapel was hungry again, but she was too old and weak to hunt. It gnaws at me now, she scrawled. It wants what's inside. Bite, it wants my breath in its branches. It will not be starved. The last entry was just 2 words. I'm sorry. Clara felt sick. She slammed the diary shut. This wasn't art. It was a shrine for some terrifying, paganistic nature cult. Her great-aunt hadn't been an artist. She had been a warden, a keeper. Clara decided she wanted nothing to do with it. The next morning, she marched out to the wicker chapel with an axe, determined to tear it down. But as she stood before it, she faltered. The structure looked bigger than ever. New, thorny branches were woven into its walls, and the entrance seemed to beckon her. A dark, gaping mouth. A wave of profound, unnatural dread washed over her, and she found she couldn't lift the axe. It was as if the air itself grew heavy, pressing down on her. She felt watched, judged by every tree in the grove. Defeated, she retreated to the house. That night, the nightmares began. She dreamt she was inside the chapel, but it was vast, a cathedral of writhing branches, and woven into the walls. She could see faces gaunt, screaming faces, their features contorted in agony. She saw Elspeth's face, her mouth open in a silent scream. And then the walls began to close in, the branches wrapping around her, pulling her in, making her part of the design. She woke up screaming, her body drenched in sweat. The changes to the chapel accelerated. A small, window-like opening appeared on one wall, a lattice of thorns that seemed to watch the house. She stopped going near it, but she felt its presence constantly, a low hum of hunger at the edge of her perception. Her own artwork suffered. She found herself subconsciously weaving wicker-like patterns into her metal sculptures. The land was influencing her, changing her. The breaking point came during a violent autumn storm. The wind howled like a starving animal, and rain lashed against the window. The power went out, plunging the house into darkness. By the fireplace, Clara heard a sound over the roar of the storm aloud, splintering crack from the direction of the grove. A morbid curiosity, a pull she couldn't explain, took hold of her. She grabbed a heavy flashlight and went outside. The woods were a thrashing chaos of wind and rain. She fought her way to the grove, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the deluge. A massive oak tree had fallen in the storm, but it hadn't fallen randomly. It had fallen directly onto the wicker chapel, crushing it. Clara felt a surge of relief, so powerful it made her weak. The beat, it was over. The storm had done what she could not. It had destroyed the hungry guard in the woods. She approached the wreckage. The intricate structure was a splintered, chaotic mess of broken branches, burnt as her light played over the ruins. She saw something that made her blood run cold. The chapel wasn't empty. The fallen oak had split it open like a rotten fruit, and inside there was something that hadn't been there before. It was a mannequin, life-sized figure woven from the same pale birch and dark willow as the chapel itself. It was a crude effigy of a woman. It lay half-crushed under the oak, its twig-like arms reaching, its featureless face turned toward the sky, and from a tear in its wicked chest, something was spilling out. Not straw, not leaves, but a dark, thick, soil-like substance that steamed in the cold rain, and mixed in with it were small, white fragments. Clara knelt, her light trembling. She recognized the shape of the fragments. They were bones, human bone, small bones from hands and feet, fragments of ribs, shards of a skull. This was no offering house. It was a tomb, a sarcophagus. Her great-aunt wasn't in a cemetery. She was in the chapel. The chapel had consumed her, just as she had feared. It had taken her breath in its branches. A new sound cut through the storm, a low, creaking, groaning sound. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from the wreckage. Clara watched in abject horror as the broken branches of the chapel began to move. Slowly, painfully, they began to writhe and twist, weaving themselves back together. The chapel was rebuilding itself around the fallen tree, incorporating the fresh wood into its design, stronger than before. It was healing, and it was still hungry. Clara didn't scream. The sound was trapped in her throat. She simply turned and ran. She didn't go back to the house. She got in her car, muddy and soaked, and drove until the sun came up. She never went back. Free. She abandoned her art, her inheritance, everything. She knows the chapel is still there, growing, changing, waiting. She broke the line, the pact of blood her family had made. And she knows that the chapel and the hungry thing it serves is now looking for a new keeper, a new offering, by a new face to weave into its walls.